Hello, and welcome to this series of discussions that we've titled Timing is Everything. We're going to talk about prophecy, end times theology, an exciting subject for most of us. We enjoy talking about it. I'm Ralph Barker, Vice President of American Vision, and I'm going to be talking with Gary DeMar, President of American Vision, who edits our monthly magazine, Biblical Worldview, the author of over a dozen books now. Let's get right to the subject here, Gary. You know, I love to talk about, learn about, even fight about eschatology or end times. One person might say, I'm a pre-tribulational rapturist. I believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. Someone else will say, I believe in a mid-tribulation rapture or a post-tribulation rapture. I even understand there's kind of a new group out there that are pre-wrath rapturists. And I'm going to let you define some of these terms. But when we're talking about prophecy, what is the real issue, the heart of the matter that we need to focus on?
Well, there are two aspects to prophecy. That is, what happens and when. And when you deal with prophecy, the when is the most important part of prophecy. There are fundamentally two groups of prophecy pundits out there. That is, those who believe that most of the prophecies in the New Testament are yet to happen. And they're called futurists. So anytime they read a prophecy in the New Testament, they believe that it is really put into the distant future, that it's something that won't happen until the very end of history. But there's another group of prophecy pundits out there who have been with the church for centuries called preterists. And preterists believe that most of the New Testament prophecies have already been fulfilled. They were future, they were true prophecy when they were given, but they have already been fulfilled for us. So those prophecies are now in the past in terms of fulfillment. Most people today, most of the prophecy advocates you hear on the radio and the television who wrote most of the popular prophetic novels and so forth dealing with end times issues are futurists. Mm-hmm. They believe that most of the prophecies in the New Testament have not been fulfilled yet. I maintain, and I believe as we go through this series, I can show that most of the New Testament prophecies have already been fulfilled. Then what I did, I went through my library. And as you know, I have a large library, especially in the area of prophecy, and I pulled out a representative sample of books which teach that most of the New Testament prophecies have already been fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. They were prophetic when they were given, but they have already been fulfilled. And here's just a sampling of some of them. Here's a book that was written in the 17th century. There's another book, the early part of the 18th century, very popular commentary by Adam Clarke. The interpreter, self-interpreting Bible commentary, John Gill, John Lightfoot, Thomas Scott, Thomas Newton on the prophecies, Dalton's commentary. Again, this is just in my library of what's available.
Now, certainly this is not the dominant view today. Most people would not agree with you at this point.
Right. In fact, most people today wouldn't even know that this particular perspective was ever around.
That's true.
And when I first became a Christian, as probably you did, and most people who are watching this right now, we're taught that Jesus is coming soon, and that Jesus is right around the corner, and his coming is imminent, and we have all these signs predicting all this. And we're living at the end of history, and it may only be a few more years before Jesus comes back because all the signs are pointing to that. And so when I went to seminary, that's what I believed. But then I got into a huge library and found that that wasn't the position of the church. And as I began to collect books on my own, as these books demonstrate, I found that the majority of those people, of those Bible commentators who wrote I've been able to find from the 16th century all the way up to the 20th century, believed that most of the New Testament prophecies were already fulfilled, and that they referred to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So the words, when Jesus said, I'm coming back soon, and the time is near, and this generation will not pass away, and we'll look at some of these passages, they meant that, and that the New Testament believers believed that Jesus was to come back in judgment upon Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple before that generation passed away. And each of these commentaries, or each of these books on prophecy that you see here on this table, and there are literally dozens and dozens more, and these are not obscure writers, believe that that's what the New Testament said. And on Matthew chapter 24 and on Matthew 16 and other passages, 2 Thessalonians 2, these commentators, for the most part, believe that those prophecies have already been fulfilled.
Over the next few half-hour segments that we're going to do, we're going to talk about a lot of different things, and we're obviously not going to exhaust this subject. So we want to let everyone know that American Vision does offer books, tapes, and a monthly magazine that will expand on this issue as well as many others. And we will be putting the address and phone number up throughout the program.
Yeah, that we really need to make that clear, that we will not be able to deal with every verse, every topic. This is designed to give the listeners and the viewers of this the impetus to go and study for themselves.
I think it'll certainly do that. It's going to get people thinking. Even if you disagree, you're going to have to think. And that's half the job of getting people back into the Bible and maybe thinking a little differently than they're used to. You know, as soon as Jesus ascended, as soon as his soles of his feet disappeared into the clouds, almost immediately they began to predict him when he was coming back again. Historically, because it's not the dominant view today, the one you've been talking about, the preterist view, is not dominant today. Throughout history, what has the church generally believed about the second coming?
Well, and again, in looking at the literature on, say, Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2 and other passages, they believed that those prophecies had to do with the coming of Jesus and judgment upon Jerusalem. But there has always been a fringe element out there, and they've always been on the fringe, who said that present-day events, present-day in terms of when they existed, pointed to the soon coming of Jesus in their generation. And the church has always been fighting that view, that Jesus was going to come back soon. So anytime there was an earthquake, or anytime there was a famine, or a plague, or a war, there were groups on the fringe who were saying, Jesus is coming back soon, Jesus is coming back soon. But over time, that fringe element began to replace the more biblical view that those prophecies referred to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And now that fringe view has become the predominant view today, where anytime there's an earthquake around the world, or anytime there's a plague, or anytime there's a war, anything that happens in the Mideast, a book is written, put out on the market, and saying that Jesus is coming back real soon. And of course, as we get to the close to the year 2000, as we get to the end of this millennium, actually the year 2001 is the end of the beginning of the new millennium, we're seeing more and more activity, more and more books coming out, novels being written, television shows predicting that Jesus is coming back soon. They won't give a specific date, but they are certainly telling us that Jesus is coming soon, that his coming is imminent. And so what began as a fringe movement now has become the predominant view. And most Christians have no idea that the preterist perspective, which was held by the church throughout the centuries, was in fact the orthodox view. And the view that is being espoused today, it really didn't get started until probably the mid-19th century and really took off at the beginning of the 20th century.
What label do you put on the predominant view today?
Well, the technical term is dispensational premillennialism. Most people probably know it better by the pre-trib rapture view, that supposedly the church is going to be raptured prior to this 7-year period in which the Antichrist is comes to the fore, and then in the middle of this seven-year period, he breaks this covenant that he made with Israel, and then he just wreaks havoc upon the earth, and then Jesus returns just near the end of that 7-year period and rescues the believers. First, he comes for his saints in a rapture where Christians are taken off the earth, and then he comes with his saints at the end of that 7-year period. That view, in all the books that you study prior to the 19th century, there is no such view ever taught anywhere. And yet today, most people think, boy, if you don't believe that view, you're not a real Christian.
So this isn't what the Apostle Paul believed.
It's not what the Apostle Paul...
He never even heard this before.
In fact, you will find most dispensationalist writers admit it really isn't a verse in the Bible that teaches a pre-tribulational rapture. What they'll do is they'll put a bunch of verses together, make a few assumptions, and say, this has got to be the church being taken off the earth prior to this 7-year period. But, a question I always ask Christians who believe that view, where did this 7-year period come from? And most can't answer it. And then you have to go back to Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel's 70 weeks, which everybody believes takes you up to the time of Christ. Whether you're a dispensationalist, a futurist, or a preterist, they all believe it takes you up to the time of Christ.
Expand on that just for a moment. There's 70 weeks of years, and that's divided up into 3 sections, I believe.
Right.
And I think all commentators, as you say, agree that the first 2 sections take you up to the advent of Christ the first time, and the disagreement comes in about this last 7 years.
What do you do with the last 7 years?
All right, so how do they handle that today?
Well, the dispensationalists handle it by putting a gap between the 483 years and those last 7 years. And what they do is put what they call the church age within that gap. So as long as the church is still on earth, that 7-year period is pushed into the future. It will only be after the church is taken off the earth that 7-year period starts again.
What do they base this parenthesis on? How do they scripturally find something here that says, okay, now suspend the 7 years?
Well, in all the research I've been able to do on this topic, there is no indication anywhere in Scripture that there is ever a gap between the periods of time that God gave. Anytime God gave a number, like you'll be in the wilderness for 40 years, or you'll be in captivity for 70 years, there's never a gap. And here they're putting a gap where there really isn't a gap. The reason that the numbers are divided up the way they are is because of what happens within that period of time. That last week is extremely important.
Well, their whole theology hinges on that last week.
Right. If that last week, if there isn't a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week of Daniel, there is no dispensational premillennialism. There is no pre-trib rapture. There's no post-trib rapture. There's no mid-trib rapture. There's no pre-wrath rapture. None of that is there. It all goes away.
So how old is this modern theology?
Well, that particular view of the gap, it's probably 150 years old.
That's all.
Right. The church has never taught that at all. There's never been a gap between the 69th and 70th week. There's always been a connection of it all. And real simple. I mean, Jesus appears at the beginning of the 70th week. He's cut off in the middle of the 70th week. And then at the last three and a half years is the gospel going to the Jews. And the timing of the 70th week is perfect. Jesus comes on the scene at the beginning of the 70th week. His ministry is about 3.5 years long. He makes a covenant with the many. I mean, you can read that in the New Testament. He sits down with his apostles and his disciples and say, this is the new covenant in my blood shed for many. Then in the middle of the week, Jesus is cut off. That's what Daniel 9 says. Then, for 3.5 years, the gospel goes to the Jews. And as soon as the Jews finally reject the gospel, Paul comes on the scene, and he's taking the gospel to the Gentiles. That's the end of the 70 weeks. And once you see that has already been fulfilled, the futurizing all this just becomes, first of all, unnecessary, and you really can't prove it from Scripture.
So as we have titled this series, timing is everything here.
Right.
And we're going to talk about some specific time texts in the remaining minutes of this session. Before we do that, though, I think we need to talk a little bit about the idea of imminency, or the immediate return of Christ. You know, I was always taught Jesus could come any second, so you better be ready, you better be good. What is imminency, and what does it have to do with what we're talking about today?
Well, imminency means closeness in terms of time. And what the dispensationalists have done, and most futurists have done, is said that Jesus could come back at any moment. His appearing is always imminent. It's always close. But when you read the New Testament, you will not find any place in the New Testament where it says Jesus could come back at any moment. Every time you talk about the coming of Christ, it's always in terms of soon, near, shortly. These things are going to take place quickly. Jesus says, I'm coming quickly. In Matthew chapter 24, which we'll talk about, it says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. The New Testament believers understood Jesus to mean that he would return shortly, that his coming is near. That their generation, in fact, it goes so far as to say that some will still be alive when this coming in judgment takes place. And so you can't take near and shortly and quickly, as they were given in the New Testament in Jesus' day, and project that 2,000 years in the future and ever believe that you can interpret the Bible literally.
It always amazed me that when you read the New Testament, especially the epistles, and you hear statements like, the end of all the ages has come upon us, it's hard to take that 2,000 years into the future, and yet we're not ashamed to do that many times. That has nothing to do with us today, but it had something to do with them at that time.
Well, in fact, if you look at the turn of this century, where liberalism was coming on the scene, Albert Schweitzer, for example, made the comment, one of the reasons why he did not believe that the New Testament could be trusted as an authentic witness of Christ, it had truths about Jesus in there, but there were lots of mistakes, is because he believed that the New Testament taught that Jesus was saying that he would return within a generation, and that the New Testament believers believed that. But since it didn't happen, the Bible can't be true. Because if Jesus was wrong about that, he was probably wrong about some other things too. But, you know, and futurists have tried to get around that by saying, well, timing really, words regarding timing really aren't that important. You know, with God, 1,000 years is a day, and a day is 1,000 years. Well, if you start saying that about timing, you can start saying that about everything. So I believe when Jesus said, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, that the end of all things is near, is at hand, I'm coming quickly, etc. That Jesus meant exactly what he said, that he would be coming in judgment within a generation to destroy the city, to destroy the temple of the Jews. And this was prophesied over and over again in the New Testament. And that language is Old Testament language that's always been used, which is another key to Bible prophecy.
And we're going to get into that in the next segment when we go through Matthew 24,
right,
verse by verse.
Right. You can't interpret the Bible by going outside the Bible. You interpret the Bible by using the Bible to interpret itself. And so when you come across a difficult passage, you look at other places in the New Testament where you find similar language, and then you compare. You use the Bible to interpret the Bible. You don't use the newspaper to interpret the Bible.
Let's go through just a couple of the key timing texts that we're going to find in the New Testament. One of them would be Matthew 10:23. Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says, "But whenever they persecute you in this city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you shall not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes."
Well, when I first became a Christian, I started reading the New Testament. And again, I was enamored with Late Great Planet Earth and a couple of other books, Re-Entry by a fellow named John White, I think. It just didn't go along with what the New Testament was saying in that passage in Matthew 10:23. "But whenever they persecute you in this city, flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you shall not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes." And then I went and I read commentaries on this, and they all fudged on it. Well, it can't mean within their particular lifetime, but that's what it says. Mm-hmm. And so what I soon learned is that the coming of Jesus has to be compared to when the Old Testament, when it talks about the coming of Jehovah. Jehovah came many times in the Old Covenant, and it was always a coming in judgment. So there's nothing unique about this language. And there's another one in Matthew, which is the most startling one of all. Matthew 16:27 and 28. "For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then recompense every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And I got the commentators out again, the more recent commentators, not these older commentators who believed that this was an obvious reference to Jesus coming in judgment in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And they say, well, this is the transfiguration, which happened a week later. Yeah. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, how does that solve the problem? How did the Son of Man come, and that solves the problem about the coming of Jesus? It doesn't. But notice what it says here. It says that there are some who were standing there who would not taste death until they saw the Son of Man coming, which means that this event had to be far enough in the future that nearly everybody was dead, but not so far in the future that everybody was dead. And we find that there is a way of handling this and giving us a perspective on this in John chapter 21. We're all familiar with this passage, which it's one of the last times Jesus talks with his disciples. Peter and John are there. And let me read this. It says, "Truly, truly I say to you, when you were younger," this is talking to Peter, "you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go." Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his breast at the supper and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" Speaking of John. Peter, therefore, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? Basically asking him, what's going to happen to him? Is he going to live out his days? How is he going to die? Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Now, you would have thought that Peter said, wait a minute, you mean your coming is going to be within his lifetime, possibly? There was no question here at all. Peter knew that Jesus was going to come back within the lifetime of some of the apostles who were going to live, because in Matthew chapter 16, 27, 28, he said he would. And so this particular passage helps us understand what Jesus is dealing with in Matthew 16, 27, and 28. And the Old Testament helps us understand the very nature of the coming of Jehovah in judgment. And we'll look at some of those passages when we get to Matthew chapter 24. But each of these texts that we've looked at so far, and there are many, many more, deal with timing. When will these things take place? And we see in Matthew 16, we see in John 21, that timing of the coming of Jesus in judgment takes place within the lifetime of some of the apostles to whom Jesus was speaking.
Also, on the John 21 reference, can't we also glean from that the idea that we should not preoccupy ourselves trying to figure out when Jesus is coming back again? You follow me. That's the real issue. Don't worry about that. You follow me and do what I command you to do.
Right. When we talk about, when will Jesus come in a consummating way, when finally at the end of history, when he sums up all things, as 1 Corinthians 15 tells us he will. He must rule until he puts all of his enemies under his feet. We're not supposed to be preoccupied with that. We have a job to do here. But at the same time, we have to get it straight about what the New Testament is saying about the coming of Jesus. And I believe that the majority of those New Testament texts refer to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. For that coming, they were to be aware, because they had to get out of the way of that potential judgment, as we'll see in Matthew 24.
Also, when Jesus was before Caiaphas, he said to Caiaphas and to the Sanhedrin, I believe that was in the plural, the Greek term there where he says, you shall see the Son of Man coming in the power of his kingdom. In his lifetime, the assumption was it would be in Caiaphas' lifetime, that you will see the Son of Man.
Right. In fact, in Matthew chapter 26, it says, I adjure you by the living God that you tell me whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robe, saying, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. And what Jesus was doing was identifying himself with the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7. And again, which we'll talk about when we get to Matthew chapter 24, about this coming of the Son of Man. What does that mean? But Jesus said, you shall see this. This will be a part of something you will experience and understand. And again, the commentators have, fudge on this passage. They don't know how to deal with it. But I think it's very plain when you put all of this together that the New Testament is saying that Jesus will come in judgment before that generation passes away.
2 Peter 3:8 you already alluded to, where it says that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. And not always, but generally the response to Revelation 1, chapter 1, tends to be that scripture. And you're familiar with 1:1, where it talks about the time text, about these things must shortly come to pass. And I don't see how you can interpret shortly in the context of 2,000 years.
Well, in fact, what you end up doing, with that particular methodology, you have to say that when you see a word near, it really means far. And when you see a word far, it really means near. Quickly means slowly. Is that the way we're supposed to interpret the Bible? What other word? A friend of ours, Ken Gentry, said, what if, taking their perspective, what if Jesus wanted to tell them that he was coming back shortly and that the time was near and that these things were going to happen quickly? What words would he have used?
It's a good question.
There aren't any other words.
No, that's a good question.
Why did the translators use these particular English words to translate those particular Greek words? The answer is very clear. It's because those words are to be translated that way. Near means near, shortly means shortly, quickly means quickly. And what's kind of ironic about this is the dispensationalists pride themselves in interpreting the Bible literally.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, no one ever does that consistently, but it's a good methodology. I mean, literally, there's nothing wrong with interpreting the Bible literally if you use the Bible to interpret the Bible. But how can they get around these passages? And not only do you find these passages in Revelation 1:1, where it says these things must shortly take place, and Revelation 1:3, where it says the time is near,
Mm-hmm.
but also in the very last chapter of Revelation, this is repeated. So on the two ends of Revelation, at the beginning and the end, and even throughout the middle of it in Revelation 3 and Revelation 7 and Revelation 12, we're giving time indicators. And each of those time indicators, without equivocation, tell us that the events described therein were to happen shortly, that the time was near. And you can't get around them. And you can't make that go 2,000 years into the future and still maintain that the book of Revelation makes any sense.
What was the convincer for me was, and most people will agree, that you have to read Daniel and understand Daniel to understand Revelation. Daniel says, and Daniel was written 700 years prior to the book of Revelation being written, Daniel says, seal up the vision because its fulfillment is many years into the future.
Right.
Then in Revelation, it says, don't seal up the vision or the book because its fulfillment is at hand.
Right.
Again, that's clear evidence.
Right, so here you have the book of Daniel written hundreds of years before the coming of Christ,
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of years before the book of Revelation. It's seal it up because the time's way in the future. You get the book of Revelation and it's supposedly 2,000 years in the future and you're not supposed to seal it. It doesn't make sense unless the reason you're not supposed to seal up the prophecy in the book of Revelation is because it's got to be open for everybody to read because the time is near. This judgment is about to come upon Israel. It was predicted nearly 40 years before. Jerusalem was going to fall. The temple was going to be destroyed. That generation was going to experience that. And, you got to get out of town.
Okay,
And
we got just about 2 minutes left in this session. Can you kind of tie all this together and emphasize again why timing has to be the crucial key to really understanding prophecy?
Well, if you don't get the timing down right, then anytime you see events, prophetic events that are described in Matthew 24, earthquakes and famines and false Christs and so forth, you will be always led astray into believing that the coming of Christ is in your generation, and you will always be wrong. And it will de-emphasize the reliability of the Bible. But if you take the Bible seriously and get the time parameters correct, then you begin to understand, wait a minute, the Bible is such a trustworthy book. It is so clear in what it says. If I can rely on it in the area of prophecy, then I can rely on it in the area of salvation. When it says that Jesus Christ came in the flesh and to save us from our sins, I can believe it. Because I can believe it in terms of prophecy. When he said he was going to come in judgment before that generation passed away, and in truth he did come in judgment before that generation passed away, those two things now make sense to me, and they've changed my life forever.
A little bit later on, we're going to talk about how we're not just talking about eschatology, we're talking about the credibility of the Bible
Exactly.
when we talk about this topic. We're going to break off here. This is a good place to stop. We're going to pick up Matthew 24 in the next session. So get your Bible, your pen and paper. This is going to be extremely fascinating, I promise. We'll be right back.